You know, when a world leader gives a big speech about a war anniversary, you expect something solemn, right? But what happens when a major newspaper just calls it a dud? Well, something's up. Today, we're going to dig into the scathing critique of Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's recent speech and figure out why it fell so incredibly flat. So really, how does that happen? How does a speech from a prime minister on such a sensitive topic get called a dud? That's the big question, right? We're going to break down exactly what this newspaper editorial had to say, point by point, to see what went so wrong. All right, so here's the setup. Prime Minister Ishiba delivers what he calls a personal statement about the war. And almost immediately, the Sankei Shimbun, a major newspaper, comes out with this editorial. And they do not mince words. They called it a lackluster report void of any outstanding insights or new points of view. Ouch! In other words, a dud. And right off the bat, the editorial makes this really important distinction. They point out that this wasn't some official government statement, approved by the whole cabinet. Nope. This was, as they put it, merely an expression of Prime Minister Ishiba's own opinions. And that little detail is super important because it really frames all the criticism that's about to come. Okay, so let's get into the first big problem the newspaper had with the speech, the actual content. What did he say? Well, Ishiba said he wanted to explain why Japan got into what he called a reckless war. But the editorial's take, his explanation was, well, anything but new. So Ishiba listed off a bunch of reasons. He talked about a report predicting Japan would lose, but it was just ignored. He mentioned the military having way too much independent power, the civilian government losing control, political assassinations by extremists, and even the media hyping everyone up for war. And look, on the surface, these are all totally valid historical points. But the newspaper's question was pretty simple. Was any of this actually new information? Was it a revelation? And just so we're all on the same page, that term he used, independence of supreme command, is a really big deal. It was part of Japan's old constitution before the war, and it basically meant the military could do its own thing without the elected government being able to stop them. It's a huge piece of the puzzle when you study this period. And this quote from the editorial just nails their whole point. They're basically saying, hey, anyone who knows anything about history or politics has heard all of this a million times before. That was their big punchline. It was a blunt way of asking, why is the Prime Minister giving us a History 101 lesson and calling it a major statement? But the criticism didn't just stop with what Ishiba did say. It actually got a lot sharper when they started talking about what he left out. The newspaper argued that the speech was totally inadequate because it was missing some really, really important context. And here's the core of it. You've got this big contrast. Ishiba's speech was all about Japan's internal screw-ups, right? Its own political and military failures. But the editorial says, hang on a second, you completely ignored everything happening outside of Japan. What about Western colonial powers all over Asia? What about the boycotts and the violence against Japanese people living abroad? By leaving all that out, the editorial claims he painted a seriously one-sided picture. So yeah, the critique of the speech's content was already pretty sharp. But the editorial board, they saved their most brutal attack for last. They pivoted from critiquing the speech to going after the Prime Minister himself. And this is where they really turn up the heat. They frame the whole thing as an issue of hypocrisy. They start questioning whether Prime Minister Ishiba's own actions actually match the lessons he's trying to teach everyone else. The editorial lays out some pretty damning comparisons. For example, Ishiba says, hey, politicians need to learn from history to keep the military in check. But then the newspaper points out, well, you never actually propose military courts to make sure that happens. Or he praises the Japanese parliament, the Diet. But then they accuse him of ignoring election results just to hang on to his own job. The bottom line here, they are directly attacking his credibility. And then comes the final blow. The editorial wraps up with this line, telling Ishiba he should ponder deeply on his own errors. I mean, wow, that's about as personal and direct as it gets, right? It's basically telling the Prime Minister to take a good long look in the mirror before he starts lecturing the country about history. So, you might be wondering, why all the fuss? It's just one speech, right? Well, here's why it matters so much. In East Asia, talking about history is never just about the past. These words are powerful political tools. They have real, immediate consequences for diplomacy, for alliances, for rivalries, everything. And this gets to a really huge geopolitical concern. The newspaper was actually relieved about one thing. They said that as flawed as the speech was, at least it didn't create a new history card for China or South Korea to play against Japan. This history card idea is a big deal. It's this fear that any apology from Japan can be used as a political weapon, trapping the country in what the editorial calls an endless loop of apologies.
Which leaves us with this really tough final question. This is the tightrope that basically every world leader has to walk when they talk about their country's difficult past. How do you actually reflect on history in a sincere way without just handing your rivals diplomatic ammo to use against you today? It is an incredibly delicate balance, and honestly, there are no easy answers.